I have interviewed like dozens of Java developers, and these are the 5 mistakes every Java Spring Boot developers as a newcomer makes, but the senior developer don't make it. Today, I will show you exactly how to code like a pro, and you can fix your missing bean, the bad configuration, or the white label errors in a quick way. If you are new to this particular channel, please subscribe to my channel so that you can notify when there are new videos like this. So let's jump into the top mistakes every Java developer as a newcomer makes it. So the very first thing is unsatisfied dependency exception, or you can call it as a missing bean. Now this is one of the most common startup failure exception, which is when you are trying to start your Spring Boot application. So what does it mean is that the Spring Boot or the IOC container has not able to find a particular dependency or a bean which you have defined in your applications, that another bean or another class when you have defined is in either on a service or a controller. So whenever you are annotating with that particular bean or trying to inject using the auto wire, or either you are using the constructor injection. So this is exception which is followed up whenever starting the application. So if you see the example over here, you can see there is a constructor which is going to be the zero parameter for the order controller. Over there it is trying to inject it. So here if you see, there is a bean which is type trying to inject it over here. I will give you the full stack trace on the next page. Now if you see here, there is a constructor, the demo controller over here, which is requiring a bean type of let's say order service. So here it could not found that particular, and that the reason it is giving that particular exception over here. So what is the solution for it? The first solution over here is you need to check that particular annotations very thoroughly. So the class, wherever you are trying to define those, whenever you are trying to inject it, you have to correctly inject that with that particular specific annotations. So we have to make use of either component, we either make use of the service, then the repository or the controller. So make sure one of this particular stereotype you have to annotate it, so that Spring Boot can scan that particular class and load it into the container. Second, what you can do is that you have to check for the scanning package. Now whenever the Spring Boot is going to start your application, it actually checks each and every component which is going to fall under the main class package scan, or there is a sub package you define that in that particular specifically. So if you don't define, it will actually take up that particular default package it is there in the src. But if you specifically want to scan some packages, you can define those as in the component @component scan. Okay, so if you look at the main application, you will see that @Spring Boot application is the main annotation. Now what it does is that internally it make use of the @component scan, which is by default going to scan the packages and it all sub packages over there. So if a bean, let's say you have defined a bean and it does not fall into that particular package or a sub package, then what you have to do in order to scan that or recognize that particular bean, you have to specifically define that component scan package. Then you have to define that particular base package over there, and then you can scan that particular thing. So this is how you solve this particular problem. I hope you have faced this particular problem as a newcomer and you are not able to understand what is the problem over here. So let's jump into the second thing, the configuration property issue. Now you have some ports, you have some URL configurations that are defined. Okay, so you in the Spring Boot there are either application.properties or YAML. So let's say if you are configuration has been done in your property files. Okay, let's say you have defined some typo error, let's say you have defined some incorrect syntax, or totally you forgot to have some prefix defined for your custom properties which you had defined your class. Okay, so the leading prefixes wherever you have to write that you have missed it. Okay, so this might have caused your application for a failure. Okay, if you are not defined it right there. So if you see, I have given you two screenshots over here, which is going to be the fail to bind property, where you don't have the server dot properties defined assigned to that particular property. And then you can see there is also a data source where the URL is not being mapped up. Okay, so this is how you get the errors, and the next page you will see the whole syntax of the stack trace. So here if you see, it is failed to bind that particular property, that is server dot port, to an integer. So here if you see, this is a nested exception. So either in the application dot properties or YML you have to define those. So let's look at this solution now. Now as a solution, what you have to do, you have to have this particular properties have to be defined in the correct way in a key value pair. Example, if you see here, server dot port is equal to 8081, right? Or in the YAML format, you defined it in the YAML format so that it doesn't the format is not missed, and you have to write it, right? So it happens many times that the person using the YML for the first time, and it has not followed that particular spacing and the tab formatting structure, and this particular application does not recognize it. Then you can actually check for the standard properties. You have to always go for the documentation for the standard properties. So there are some specific predefined properties as a documentation which it is going to refer by default. So let's say spring.datasource.url. So you have to give this particular, if you have single database and then database URL you have configured for any database, you have to define this. Then at the third thing, you can actually check for @configuration properties. So these are basically used when you have defined your own configuration, the custom configuration, and then you have to annotate with that particular annotation, so that that particular properties are binded to that particular Java fields in that particular class. Okay, so this is going to make it very type safe, and also it is going to have that particular easy to manage and validate, and also it is we can make use of the relaxed binding in that as well. Then we have incorrect dependency management starter. So this is a quite I would say most used, or most I would say exceptions which are occurring. So at the beginner, what sometimes they manually do is that they manually define the transitive dependencies, or they define some specific dependencies instead of defining the starter over there. So if you want let's say core features, if you wanted some web MVC feature specifically, you doesn't have to define that particular manually in that starter in the pom.xml, right? So what you have to do, that you have to just define that starter dependency, and internally Spring Boot will take care of that. Because if you don't define like that, then there might be some version conflicts, there might be some different issues which it might fall into. So always try to have that particular starter dependency. Now if you see here, I've given you a starter stack trace over here, where it is trying to find the JDBC template over here, but there was no such being found over there. Okay, so this is a I would say an example, a common example where you have not defined some specific versions over there. So what you have to do, you have to rely on that particular starter. So there are lot of starter for different, like for web is there, for JDB Spring Boot data JPA is there. If you have to want to define for Lombok, you have defined lot of other things. Okay, so you can actually check out the official documentations and find out what are the different starter dependencies you can add it, and then add it in the pom.xml. So these starter dependencies have got their own compatible and the required libraries that are defined inside their transitive dependencies. So you doesn't have to manage them manually, everything is managed internally with that particular plugin defined in the parent. Okay, so all the versions are defined inside that. Then there is a poor exception handling. So it is also called as an white labeled error. So by default, let's say you don't have any exception handled in your application, so it will result into a white label error, so which is an kind of an uniformity way where you get an error. Okay, so this can be very this can be done by the newcomer where they are not knowing how to handle this particular thing. So at this track trace there will be a leak, okay, and it is going to expose some internal details also. So make sure you don't you handle those particular exception very well. Okay, now we'll look at the example. So if you see here, there is an slash error over here. You're getting this error, right? If you see here, so there is some exception which is going the white label error. So it is throwing this particular as an order is null, or let's say order ID is not able to find it, or let's say you have some null pointer exception. It is not going to invoke that particular get ID. Okay, so these kind of exception might throw some exception, and it is going to show that. So in order to solve that, you can actually have a global exception handling mechanism implemented. So you have to define at the rate controller advice. You can define the annotations and the class, and then define the exception handler for that particular specific exception you want to handle. So you can define those particular methods, how to return those particular specific message, so that it can catch it. It can return that specific error format, whatever at the standardized across the application, so that it should not it should have common application should have a standard format as a return, right? So let's say null pointer exception is happening, so it should return in the same format where the exception is written in for the, let's say other exception it has occurred. Okay, so it should have show some meaningful error. It should have some standard format, like it should be JSON format is not there, or some status code should be written, so that it understand by the requester that something is wrong at their end, and then they can change that and then resend that particular request. Then you have the misunderstanding. So the auto configuration. So what happens, Spring Boot internally make use of the automatic configurations. So whatever the class beans it finds in that particular class path, it is going to configure those. So as a newcomer, you don't particularly understand this particular concept, and you try to override certain properties, certain behavior, which internally Spring is going to take care. Okay, let's say database configuration, right, or data source, right? So that is one you Spring Boot internally handles it. Now if you see here, data source, custom data source over here, you required some bean type, so that data source is not found over here. Now what you have to do, you have to check for that particular documentation, you have to check for that Spring dot properties factories, that is it is going to automatically configure those whenever it is trying to detect some user defined beans, or if there are defined in the same type. Okay, so to override this, simply you define your own beans over there, but in order to avoid that, you can use a simple default behavior. Now why this particular bean is configured or not, you can check some conditions by running your application in a debug mode. So there is a debug -- debug flag which you can use, or you can actually have this particular meta configuration, meta information that is defined in your auto configuration. So this auto imports, there is a file in the starter jar, right? You can define those, and you can check those details. Okay, uh, so that's all from this particular video. I hope I was able to explain you uh, all the important exceptions which are uh, made by the new developer. They are not aware of how to handle this particular exception, or they get really frustrated if this particular exceptions are coming and as a newcomer. So these are the common exceptions, and I also gave you the solution, so that you can easily solve this whenever you are trying to work on the Spring Boot applications. If this video has given you some value, please give a thumbs up, and also don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Thank you for watching.